Thank you for having the recording. And yeah, just some housekeeping rules. Once again, this webinar is being recorded, so please remember to keep your muted and turn off your camera if you're not comfortable with it in the recording. And in terms of our questions, so we will be gathering questions throughout the webinar from folks in the chat. You may feel, if you feel more comfortable sharing it directly to me, may private message me your question and we'll share it at the end when we have our Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please remember to put your questions in the chat and we will get through as many as we can. And in the meantime, you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick overview of our program for today. So we're very fortunate to have several different speakers who will talk to us about some of the cultural, spiritual, political, and economic harms that we see as brought on by U.S. militarism and even militarizers. So Megan will be off with kind of an idea of what even is self-determination, how do we see it happen, how do we see it in the cultural and legal contexts that we see now. Then we'll move over to Mele, who will talk about some of the cultural and spiritual harms against the Maoli, and Yazan, who will talk about the political harm against the Palestinian people, and then who will talk about the economic harm against the Filipino people. Though we do mention here that, like specific harm, we can see that all of these different kinds of harm are all interconnected. So they'll also be touching on the cultural, spiritual, political, and economic harm, all the different contexts that we'll be covering today. So from here, I will pass it on to Megan, who will share with us what self-determination even is. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Megan. I'm going to be talking about the idea of self-determination as a political and legal concept. So I'm going to be really focusing on kind of the formal version of self-determination, and then we'll see in the conversations with our three brilliant panelists what that can mean at a more genuine lived level. So I'll be talking on some background on the development of self-determination within the United Nations and its relevance for international law. And so my hope is that we can get kind of an understanding of what self-determination is in this very legalistic international sense as a valuable tool for Indigenous rights, for collective liberation, and for demilitarization, but also to really emphasize that colonial powers continue to use this idea of self-determination to prolong their occupations and dispossession. So this discussion will ideally, push us towards that deeper understanding of self-determination. And then Mele, Yazan, and Andan will get us into that deeper kind of idea of self-determination free from US military influence. And Kevin, I'm just looking in the slides now if it's possible to turn off the sound when new folks enter. I think people are asking for that in the chat. Okay, and we can go to the next slide on what is self-determination. So what is self-determination? Let's go ahead and pop some ideas and definitions into the chat. How do you all think of self-determination? We'll just give it a couple seconds.
I think of it as religious.
Great, I hear religious. I see bases out, land back. Any other ideas? The people in a place and of that place making their own choices, not being dictated by colonial international powers, national sovereignty. Fantastic. So as a legal idea, self-determination has roots in political theory dating back several centuries. But for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to enter with the post-World War II UN Charter, that 1945 governing document that, at least on paper, tried to establish a cooperative framework for the international system. The UN Charter explicitly protects the right to self-determination, which they define as a people's right to determine their political, economic, social, and cultural statuses and practices. So this kind of narrow definition of self-determination, but still an important one, has been invoked by the UN in a number of landmark declarations and resolutions. For example, the 1960 Declaration on the Granting of Independence and Colonial Countries, or of Colonial Countries and Peoples. Basically, this said that colonization is a human rights violation. It was invoked in the 2007 Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which recognizes that Indigenous peoples have not only faced injustice by colonizing powers, but also that they have particular rights conferred by their indigeneity to particular places. Really recently, the 2023 UN resolution on the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, a recent affirmation that Palestinian people not only have the right to exist, to survive, but also that the existence of an independent state of Palestine has a right to exist without Israeli occupation. So we can see some of the ways that the definitions y'all are putting in the chat of autonomy, of voices, of choices consistent with values get worked into this. But as we're going to go into the next slide, we'll talk about how this legal version of self-determination also has a lot of deep flaws. So we can move into the next slide. Perfect. So this 1945 UN Charter, of course, codified this right to self-determination. But how has it been pursued or achieved or even, in this case, thwarted by that same so-called international community that codified it? One of the ways the UN has tried to facilitate global self-determination is by creating this list of places that it deems eligible for formal political decolonization. This is the list of non-self-governing territories, places that are occupied by foreign powers, which of course includes the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, the usual Western culprits of colonization. And basically these are places that the UN says do not have self-determination per their definition. Again, meaning that they have been denied the opportunity to determine their own political, economic, social, and cultural institutions. So back in 1946, right after World War II, on the founding of the United Nations, this list actually included 72 non-self-governing territories across the world. 80 years later, after a lot of formal political decolonization, which of course we don't want to confuse with actual decolonization, the list is down to 17 non-self-governing territories. And you can see on this list that includes US territories of the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Guam or Guam. So these are places that the United Nations explicitly recognizes as not having formal self-determination. We can go to the next slide. Oops, sorry, I lost my notes for a second. So again, we can definitely recognize that this legal international concept of self-determination is valuable. It gives valuable leverage in the fight against ongoing colonization. But at the same time, it's a very narrow definition that has often been determined by colonial powers who have disproportionate international influence. So while we can, yes, definitely celebrate or applaud or be happy that this list has gone from 72 countries in 1946 to 17 non-self-governing territories since, we also don't want to confuse that with real, genuine self-determination, and certainly not with justice from imperialism. So because this formal self-determination has been channeled through the UN, which again is itself a Western state-centric institution, the trajectory of self-determination tends to be defined by those same colonial powers and the so-called international community that favors these countries like the United States that have economic, military, and diplomatic power to disproportionately steer international relations. And we can go to the next slide. So to just ground this discussion in a couple of very brief examples, we're going to look shortly at Hawaii and Puerto Rico. These are two places that have been removed from that list of non-self-governing territories, but in ways that definitely did not translate into genuine self-determination. For example, we know that the United States overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom back in the late 19th century was illegal. We know through these ku'e anti-annexation petitions that many Hawaiian people protested and refused the US claims to the islands. And yet the occupying US government ended up with that huge influence over the process through which Hawaii would be, quote unquote, granted the right to self-determination. In Hawaii, this alleged self-determination took the form of a vote in 1959. And you can see from the ballot here that it didn't actually include any other options than becoming a US state or not. It meant that self-determination could only take the form, in this case, of remaining a US territory without basic rights, yet still subject to US laws, or becoming a US state. So again, we see this very constrained self-determination in this kind of legal, formal political sense, which was further compounded by the fact that settlers in Hawaii, including, of course, Americans who had very particular political and economic interests, were able to vote on this political status. So the self in self-determination also matters. And in this case, it was channeled through that occupying government's definitions. The US has used similar tactics in other places. For example, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau, all three of which are independent countries that became independent in the 80s and 90s, but in ways that tie them very closely to the United States. And actually, I think today, like as we speak, the US is conducting their Valiant Shield military exercises in Palau, maybe also in Guam. So if anybody in this call has witnessed some of these exercises, please feel free to chime in on what that has looked like in the chat, particular to self-determination. Another example, next slide. Another example of this self-determination being channeled through colonial practices is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was taken off the list in 1953 after it approved an internal constitution. But of course, this constitution did not mean that the 1898 Treaty of Paris between colonial Spain and colonial United States was nullified. It didn't mean that the US occupation of Puerto Rico ended. As we talked about in our last webinar on military exercises across the world, the US military actually continued to use the Puerto Rican island of Vieques for target practice decades after its removal from the UN list of non-self-governing territories. So even though Puerto Rico has officially received self-determination by being removed from the UN list of non-self-governing territories, we definitely need to continue to question whether that self-determination has also entailed the right to choose political, economic, social, and cultural practices in Puerto Rico, and whether this definition per the United Nations is comprehensive enough in the first place. So just to conclude this very brief overview of what self-determination is and is not, we can think of it as something that is, yes, a very powerful political tool, even in this legal sense, that can be invoked in support of people's rights. But we should also be cautious of relying on these formal international legal frameworks that still continue to channel self-determination through institutions that erase alternative political configurations and really maintain that colonial status quo. So in today's webinar, we're going to hear some examples of how US military exercises like RIMPAC violate self-determination, not only in this formal international sense, but also at the very intimate and community scales that we'll get to hear from our speakers. And with that, I will pass it on to Mele.
Thank you so much, Megan. So my name is Mele Moniz Mele-Maikalani. I am Kanaka Oiwi. I was born and raised in Hawaii. And for those who do not know, Kanaka Oiwi, Kanaka Maoli, that's the terms that Hawaiians, Native Hawaiians use to identify with. And it just usually dependent on the person that you ask. The reason I'm choosing to start with talking about what Kanaka Oiwi means, which it really does come to this word of iwi, or bones. And I'll get into it a lot further in the presentation, but I want to start with that because it kind of helps articulate this perspective of cultural and spiritual sovereignty that I want to talk about just in general to kind of help people understand the harm of RIMPAC. And so even though I was born and raised in Hawaii, I also was born and raised in a family that still practices traditional practices. So I was raised in my culture. Hawaiian was my first language. I was raised in my community, and I was raised on my aina. And that is a very privileged thing for me to be able to say that I was raised on my aina, because exercises like RIMPAC and the militarization of our lands results in, most often, right, people being pushed out of aina, pushed off of the land, especially Native Hawaiians. And so I want to talk about those effects of RIMPAC culturally, spiritually, but also how that affects our own identity formation as Kanaka Oiwi. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, if you are non-Indigenous, it's very hard to conceptualize the cultural and spiritual harm. And that's because from our perspective, we innately live within a spiritual universe. And what does that mean? That means the physical reality that we, our settlers, tend to propose as being the only reality, right, is almost negligible to an extent, because the spiritual reality controls all within the physical. So spiritual always informs the physical. And so when we talk about the cultural and spiritual effects, and usually I say cultural and spiritual effects when I'm talking to a non-Indigenous audience, because traditionally, right, our culture is intertwined with the spiritual. But for Western societies, you have to always separate cultural from spiritual, because that's what the law and the way that the settler systems are set up to do, is to separate them. But for us, and I'm sure for other Indigenous peoples, it's one and the same. And we talk about this idea of living within the spiritual universe, because then that informs the way that we look at the cultural and spiritual harm. And so as oceanic people, because although we're Native Hawaiian, we're part of Oceania, we're part of Polynesia, we're part of this greater expansive peoples that exist within this region. And so that means we have numerous genealogies, we have different cosmologies that all intersect across Oceania. And so when people talk about Native Hawaiians as being just isolated people, right, it's important to recognize that we've never been isolated. We are wayfinders. We are the people who have gone across to other peoples, and we are comprised of that intersection. And so going into our cosmology, one of the biggest ways in which we kind of talk about the birth of Hawaiian peoples is through the Kumulipo. And it's really important that we talk about the Kumulipo because this is an important illustration of what it means to be interconnected as a people. And so the Kumulipo is a creation chant, and it talks about how basically our gods came together to form our actual land, or Aina. So we have Papa and Wakea. So Papa is the Earth Mother, and Wakea is Sky Father. They come together, and through their coupling, subsequently is the birth of the land. And this is important to note, right? Because through the birth of the land from Papa and Wakea comes the first Native Hawaiian person. And through that, it shows that we're genealogical descendants of our Aina. And for us, this is imperative because first and foremost, when Papa and Wakea come together, right, there's a birthing from this darkness. Kumulipo is Po, the darkness, the birthing that comes from the utter expansive darkness. And Po is an important aspect to talk about because not only is that where everything is birthed, but it's also where we return to upon our deaths in this lifetime. And in Po is where now us, within present day societies, where our ancestors reside, right? And so we have a genealogical connection to Po, to our ancestors, to our Aina, but also that informs Mana. So Mana is our spiritual divine power. And it's important to talk about Mana because everything within the spiritual universe contains Mana, but to varying extents. And so when we talk about harm that befalls us from things like exploding our land and blowing it up, it's important to talk about how that intersects with the loss of Mana, right? To be able to grow our capacity as a people, we need Mana. We need to be able to use our Mana, to exhibit our Mana, because it informs our capacity to live a well-balanced life. And so this also goes into that which is Pono. Pono is right, or it goes into that which is just. And in order to live within the spiritual universe as a people, it's incredibly important that we talk about maintaining Pono. So we know that we're birthed from Po, that we all have Mana to varying extents, and that we need to ensure what is right and just to be able to live within a balanced spiritual universe. If the universe is not balanced, if our spiritual universe is compromised, we are compromised as a people because of our interconnectedness. And so that would be lokahi. That's the balance that we uphold by doing that which is pono, or that which is just and right. And it's important that we talk about this because this is how we configure ourselves through not just understanding who we are as Kanaka Oiwi within the spiritual universe, but understanding who we are based on our families. Genealogy informs Mana, how much Mana you have, right? The ways in which you intersect as a person through your ancestors, that informs what kind of Mana you hold, which is incredibly important because genealogy in Hawaii is political. Genealogy is how we derive power. And that's an important aspect because within the spiritual universe, the more capacity you have for spiritual power, the more capacity you have from an authority perspective of having a responsibility to your people. And so that also connects to how you see yourself as a Kanaka Oiwi on our own Aina. If you ask any person in Hawaii, what does Aina mean? Innately, people are like, oh, you know, if they're not Kanaka Oiwi, they'll be like, oh, it just means land, right? But if you're a Oiwi, you know Aina means that which feeds. And this is really important to conceptualize because you ask any Hawaiian, whether it be in Hawaii or they grow up in diaspora, they know innately that Aina really does come a nourishment perspective of that which feeds us physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. We need Aina because that which feeds us is going to always be Aina through this symbiotic relationship that we hold as Aina's descendant. But who is Aina? Because I talked about, Sky Father, Earth Mother coming together, right, to birth the Hawaiian people. But Earth Mother, or Papa, right, Papa Hanau Moku, you can also say that she is Haumea. One of her different reiterations as a person is the goddess Haumea. And so we know as a people that every single Kanaka Oiwi, all within our spiritual universe, including the land, the sea, all of our resources, right? All of that is an aspect of Haumea. And so we are all through this interconnectedness within the spiritual universe affected. And why is this so important? And I know if you're not Hawaiian, you're like, oh my God, she's going so deep into this. But it's important that I present it from this perspective because people don't understand, if you are not Oiwi or if you're not Indigenous, the extent by which this rules our lives, right? If you grow up in diaspora, for example, I was having a conversation with someone and they're asking me, I feel all this darkness that I'm working through and all this pain, and I don't understand. It's not mine, but it's something that I carry. And from a spiritual perspective, immediately I knew it's because as a people who are interconnected, we feel everything physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, we carry it together. So a harm that's befallen our land is something that we genuinely feel within our body. And can you imagine the extent by which you are like trying to conceptualize that if you're not born and raised on your land and in your community, you think that's all yours when that's not the case, right? So it's important to see that there are physical effects on us and our bodies, our mind, our soul, from this idea of, or from RIMPAC, of people being able to just blow things up and affecting our Aina. It's not just our Aina that's being impacted, it's also us. But this now goes back to this concept of kuleana, or the sacred reciprocal responsibility that we hold to each other and all within the spiritual universe to ensure that pono, or that which is right and just, is something that is enacted to ensure that all of us are able to live a healthy life that's free of this type of detriment. Because not only are Kanaka Uivi, we've always been striving to kind of rebuild after 90% of our population was decimated, right, during colonization, and continues to be enduring this ongoing trauma and ongoing trauma that's compounding over time, right? But it's also from this perspective of we have a kuleana to our Aina to ensure that she isn't also exploited in the same way and that she isn't actually harmed to this extent. And so this goes to this idea of aloha. And I know aloha sounds crazy when we talk about aloha as being from a commodified perspective of being cheapened by colonization, right? Aloha actually is that which transcends all across all space and time. It's this love that we have for each other. It's not little L, right? Just love, but it's like that big L love that encompasses everything it is that we have as a people. And I included the definition by OEV cultural and spiritual practitioner Jennifer Gonzalez, who is my spiritual teacher, to kind of help understand the importance and this essence of aloha as being the grounding force that connects us all and joins us all through our interconnectedness. Next slide, please. And so I did want to talk about the traditional governing system. So to understand why it is important that we talk about these cultural and spiritual effects, you have to kind of understand what Hawaii was like before colonization, right? And this still does impact us now, because when you talk about things like the aloha spirit or how much, how kind Hawaiians are, it really does come down to the ohana system. So before colonization, the ways in which we governed ourselves, one form of that was through the ohana system. And the ohana system is important because who knows us best in the entire world, right? Who's in charge of our education, spiritually, culturally, who helps us understand who we are within the spiritual universe? It's our family, right? Because not only do they understand the kuleana, or the sacred reciprocal responsibility that we hold to all within the spiritual universe, because that comes from our genealogy, right? But they also understand who we are as a people because they're there and they watch us through every aspect of our life and living. It's our ohana who understands who we are. And so it's our elders who help guide us, who help us decide and understand who we are and how that then interacts with who we can be in our society. And then also the ahupua'a system, the land tenure system, that's set up and based from land out, From a liberation perspective, right, everybody loves to talk about the ways in which we could conceive of this new world free of colonization. But from a Hawaiian perspective, from a Kanaka Oiwi perspective, we have the Ahupua'a system that allows us to see the ways in which we've held land as being the governing basis that we derive all of ourselves as being. It creates that relationship that we hold to Aina. And if you know how the Ahupua'a system interacts with you and your own specific kuleana within your family and as a person, you can understand what your relationship to land has to be in that way, right? And it goes back to this importance of water. Everything, the Ahupua'a system is based on this idea of water. Different ways in which fresh water comes from the mountains and then goes to the kai, to the ocean. And so we understand our concept of water because water is truly what informs the Ahupua'a system and is based on where we choose to settle near the water, right? Which waters you choose to settle at and your family chooses to settle at does really inform who you are from a spiritual perspective. Water contains all of not just the spiritual nourishment that we need as a people, but it also includes all of like life force consciousness is included within our water. It's nourishing us physically, spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. And it's comprised of these different essence or aspects of all of our kupuna, because even knowing that the ways in which we have, when we talk about burying our dead, you can go through different rituals where people are interned within the sea. And so we know that where our iwi or our bones are interred, right, that does absorb within to the water. That means all of our mana, our DNA is within that water. That means that our ancestors exist within that water. Their life force consciousness is within that water. And it's important that when we talk about water, not just from this perspective of physically needing water, we understand the wisdom, the ike that's included within the vai. And so this is an important aspect of how we as Kanaka Oiwi comprise our identity as a people. And so we talk about identity in Nana Ike Kumu. If you read any of from Mary Kavana Pukui, it's important to think about it as a triangle. So one aspect of the triangle is Aina, and then the other aspect is Na'akua, or the gods, and then the other aspect is our Lahui. We need all three of that to be able to live a balanced life. And the way in which we conceive of having that balance, right, or why it's important is because it goes back to our interconnectedness as a people. So not only as genealogical descendants, we know as Oiwi that we have three spiritual centers, our manava or the fontanelle, your pico, right, or your belly button, your umbilical cord, your ma'i or genitals. All aspects of that connects you to the past, present, and to the future. And so at every single moment of every single time, we are connected to every Kanaka Oiwi, past, present, and to come, which includes all of our ancestors, which includes all of the Aina, right? As well as all within the spiritual universe. And so this is important to talk about because it also goes hand in hand with this idea of the Lokahi triangle. Because if we know that our identity is comprised of Aina, Na'akua, and Lahui, we know those are integral aspects of us becoming a balanced person, right? Then we know that we have these three spiritual centers that informs the ways in which our actions, our kuleana, to the past, to the present, and to the future. But also this idea of our body, mind, and spirit having its own connection within ourselves, and why we need that to be balanced in order to live a well-balanced life. Okay, next slide, please. And so why is this important, right? It's always a question to ask, why does it matter? And it matters because this is how we conceptualize Kanaka Oiwi sovereignty. And from a cultural and spiritual perspective, it's important that we understand what sovereignty means, not from a Western settler perspective, but from Kanaka Oiwi epistemology. And that would be through this concept of ea. Oftentimes when people talk about ea, people talk about it as just being political sovereignty. And while that is a reasonable application of ea, it's important to understand that it encompasses so much more than that. And I think from at least my perspective, right, this overall definition of ea as being It's our independence, our life, this air, our breath, our respiration, this act of rising and of even becoming erect, right? Because within that is our capacity to birth our own selves, right? That which enables our creation to continuously proliferate, to continuously be imbued with past, present, and to come. I think that's so powerful. It's not merely just political sovereignty. It's important to talk about this idea of cultural sovereignty as being tangible and intangible aspects of it. And then when I say spiritual sovereignty, again, spiritual should be encompassed within cultural, but spiritual is an important aspect because we should be able to have our cultural and traditional practices, the intangible and tangible aspects, because that's the exercise of our spiritual determinations or our spiritual conceptions of Ea. Next slide, please. So different OEV scholars have discussed the meaning of Ea, and so I always find it so interesting to see the ways in which other OEV have conceptualized it. But Dr. Noelani Goodyear, she cites a few other OEV scholars, and so one of them is Leilani Basham. Dr. Basham talks about Ea is relating back to the birth of our people, right? From the Kumulipo, Ea is that birth from the darkness, which means that in every single time, every single way in which we're able to exercise our sovereignty or exercise Ea, it goes back to Po, right? Innately, it is that which births or is being birthed. Everything goes back to that initial darkness. And so in many ways, it's a clean slate. Every opportunity to be able to exercise Ea is a new opportunity that's full of exponential potential. Next slide, please. And so also Dr. Goodyear cites to Kumu Winchester's definition. And I think it's important to talk about it from this idea of the interconnectedness, this interdependence that we have within ourselves, that we have within, as Kanaka Oiwi, within the spiritual universe, that informs the ways in which that we interact with our Aina, with our land, right? Because we talk about things like Aloha Aina and Malama Aina. Aloha Aina is going to the ways in which we care and our love for the land, that symbiotic relationship that we hold. And Malama Aina also within that same stream of thought is the way in which we care for our Aina through that lens of Aloha. And it's important that we talk about it, sovereignty coming from that perspective, because the ways in which we conceive of Ea is based on that interdependentness, that interconnectedness, because we cannot be if not for our Aina. And so we care for our Aina and we learn to care for ourselves and we learn to care for each other. Next slide, please. But I also think it's important that we conceptualize Ea from a class lens of perspective. Oftentimes, and me as an academic, I totally see the validity of this, and not just the validity, but how important it is that we understand that liberation does not just mean we have a job and we just do that job, right? It's never going to be just doing the job and working within the settler system. We also have to be organizing, striving for liberation through other means. And that is because essentially, not only because our liberation is dependent upon us not conforming to the settler system and finding other ways in which we can strive to create our own future, to have that self-determination, but also it's because it's Kanaka Oiwi who are the least privileged, who are forced to be in these positions of needing to strive to be able to exercise Ea, but from the most disenfranchised and marginalized positions. And they cannot do that without us being there to support them and to back them up and to find ways to understand not just the class struggle of the privileged Kanaka Oiwi who are conforming enough to just perpetuate the system and doing just enough to get by or having just enough money to live and survive, right? But understanding that who we are as a Lahui should be across all classes, across all dimensions of not just space and time from a spiritual perspective, but also from that perspective of building coalition and building pilina or relationships amongst ourselves. Next slide, please. And so this goes hand in hand with the ways in which RIMPAC affects us. So culturally and spiritually, understanding that we live within a spiritual universe, that means we are being harmed on a physical level, on a mental level, spiritually, emotionally. And please do not think that this harm is negligible, right? Especially taken in conjunction with all else that's occurring and happening to Kanaka Oiwi. But this also then constrains our capacity to exercise our cultural, spiritual, political sovereignty. It continues our own exploitation and leads to eventual eradication. And this also uses this fear of hostility to reinforce this idea of helplessness, that we're not able to do anything on our own, right? That we innately have always been these helpless people, and that if not for our saviors, the United States, right, we wouldn't be in a position to be able to exercise any sovereignty or to even be alive and living. It's kind of a huge deal, and that has a very lasting impact on the way that you construe yourself over time, especially for Kanaka Oiwi. This also devalues the worth of our Aina, because it now just continues to normalize this idea that you can just bomb the heck out of our lands, of our waters, and to not just have like the physical degradation of our environment, but like the spiritual and physical harm to us and all within our spiritual universe because of that interconnectedness. And this goes hand in hand with the tourism industry that exploits us, that commodifies us, that appropriates our land, our culture, and even us as people in order to further the settler state in its own initiatives. And this also prevents us from rebuilding our spiritual capacity. If you continually devalue and denigrate our land, our bodies, our people, the effect is that we don't have the spiritual capacity to be able to make any assertions of physically, mentally, or even emotionally. It really gets to you and erodes you as a people, or us as a people, over time. And so it's important that when we talk about the cultural and spiritual effects, that we understand it as Kanaka Oiwi within the spiritual universe. And I'm going to always say that over and over and over again, because I think it's easy to forget how important and how much that really does inform our physical reality, because it is detrimental no matter if settlers want to believe that it's true or it's not. So that is my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mele. If you could give her a reaction, round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing about the cultural and spiritual harms and talking the ideas about what Ea truly means. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Yazan. Yazan, if you could please unmute. Thank you so much again, Mele.
Can folks hear me okay? Cool. So my name is Yazan, and I'm a Palestinian organizer and community-based researcher. A lot of my work and organizing focuses on the overlaps of war, migration, surveillance, and social welfare. I'm a co-founder of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and a longtime member of the Palestinian movement. And I am currently talking to y'all from Tongvaland, otherwise known as Los Angeles. If we can go to the next slide. So just briefly, the Palestinian Feminist Collective launched formally in March 2021, actually on Women's Day, with a petition that was called Palestine is a Feminist Issue, which you can find on our website, which I can link here. And the Palestinian Feminist Collective is a collective of Palestinian and Arab feminists who are looking at the overlaps of gender-based violence, Zionism, and imperialism, and its impact on the Palestinian people. And yeah, so if we can bump along to the next slide. Just really briefly, for folks who are maybe not familiar with the framing of Palestine being a feminist issue, a lot of the things that we look at in the Palestinian Feminist Collective are how gender and sexuality are manipulated to justify colonization and imperialism against the Palestinian and Arab people. And so for us, we argue that the militarization of Palestine depends on gendered violence that includes reproductive violence, the victimization of women and queers to justify imperial and colonial intervention, and the portrayal of our men as violent. I think you'll see this especially with the portrayal of the resistance in the last several months and allegations of sexual violence, also overshadowing the utilization of systemic sexual violence that the Zionists utilize against Palestinian people. And so Zionism has long depended on gendered violence to justify and sustain its settler colonial militarization of Palestinian bodies and land. And so I'll touch a little bit on reproductive genocide and reproductive violence, but I will also be linking some statements and some things that in toolkits y'all can check out to dive deeper into some of the conversations that I'm referencing here. If we can go on to the next slide. So I'm trusting that folks generally have been keeping abreast of the day-to-day news that's been going on since October 7th. But just to anchor us in some material conditions for the conversation that I wanted to walk us through today around self-determination. At this point, the death toll of Palestinians has reached at least 40,000 martyrs, and these are very, very, very conservative estimates, because a huge part of the difficulty in actually counting the number of dead is dependent on the fact that you have to be able to find the bodies, you have to be able to access different land like places to be able to locate, and there's still a lot of people missing. Right now, there's projections that there will be at least 1 million people who will experience famine in Gaza for the foreseeable year. 2% of children in Gaza have been martyred through this death toll, which I think is a really important framing when we're thinking of reproductive justice and reproductive violence and the attack on children. And you have 1.5 million Palestinians in Gaza displaced internally, and at least 500,000 Gazans who've been forced to flee. So for folks who are familiar with Nakba in 1948, where 750,000 approximately Palestinians were displaced, this is about 2/3 of that number, the 500,000 that are being forced to leave again. And Nakba is considered the formal onset of the ousting of Palestinians. At least 24 hospitals have been rendered inoperable, with none left in Gaza as of December 2023. And by inoperable, that means that folks are unable to access anesthesia, folks are unable to access electricity while performing operations. For example, mothers are giving birth without any anesthetics. You have a lot of folks who are on long-term medical care, such as dialysis or chemo, who are not able to receive access to those. Wound care is also something that people cannot guarantee in hospitals. And so there are still some technically like medical centers functioning in Gaza, but I think what is technically considered functional versus what is actually humane are very, very different things. And right now, the projected deaths that are being discussed, and again, these are by UN type NGO organizations, so very, very removed and formal, are projecting deaths to be up to 200,000 in Gaza, depending on whether or not resources are actually let through anytime soon. So very bleak, very intense, and I think it's just important to anchor us in some of the conversation of the material conditions. If we can go to the next slide. And I think in terms of how we're understanding the political situation, multiple massacres have taken place. So I referenced reproductive genocide and violence. Some of the massacres include massacres against women and children who were seeking refuge in schools, for example, in winter 2023. The most recent massacre took place in Rafah when Zionist military bombed tents that were technically labeled a safe zone. And that also led to fires that then also led to more resources being lost from other refugees. And for folks who are unfamiliar, a lot of people have been forced to flee to Rafah, and specifically a safe zone in Rafah in Gaza, only to be killed there. And so there's a perpetual targeting of safe zones happening in Palestine as a psychological tactic, which is a longtime Zionist tactic to create the feeling of inescapability, to create the feeling of inevitable death, and also to create submission and fear, right? You also have on the political landscape, the US's pseudo-condemnation, right, of what happened in Rafah, for example, and generally their hesitancy to actually condemn anything directly in a way that is substantive. For example, most recently, Biden's refusal to name the Zionist incursion in Rafah a full-scale invasion. So this pseudo thing that he kept saying, the red line, and what is the red line, which is why you'll see popular Palestinian organizers calling for, we determine what the red line is, and the red line has long been crossed, right? You have the infrastructural gutting of Gaza, which is also going to lead to long-term devastation. So there's so much intensity and focus around ending the fighting, right? The ceasefire and these kinds of things, but this actually doesn't even allow for acknowledging the fact that the long-term impact of this type and this caliber of military bombardment from Zionists is its own form of continuing to repress Palestinians and continue to impede on self-determination, because this alone is already warranting so much international involvement and international aid. And then also relatedly, a lot of the US media especially focuses a lot on Gaza, but I just wanted to uplift, you have mass arrests happening in West Bank in 1948 Palestine. You have the number of prisoners between October 7th and now has more than doubled. And you have a lot of especially activists and anti-Zionist organizers who have popular influence being regularly arrested and detained by Zionist military. And on the right here is a picture of the tent bombings that took place. 8 missiles were launched, allegedly under the fact that, alleging that there were leaders of the party in Hamas who were there, and of course it's civilians. But anyway, so I know this is very bleak and I don't mean to run through it casually, but I just do think it's important to name the political context we're in and give some updates on the specificity of the material conditions right now. If we can go to the next slide. So what I wanted to talk about in relation to the political subjugation of the Palestinian people and political harm, right now, I think a lot of the folks here are folks who identify as anti-imperialist, as folks who identify as anti-colonial and these kinds of things. So the awareness of the fact that the Palestinian context is not brand new. This is not, right, this moment that's happening is not exceptional. I think there's a lot of things that are brand new and maybe unprecedented in terms of the ways that the world has been moving in response to what's taking place. The number of people killed at once and all of these things are really, really, really important and really intense. There's a lot of bleakness. And also, this moment is not at all exceptional. It's exactly on par with the trajectory of Zionist colonialism and US imperialism. What we are witnessing is the next stage of those things, right? And I think that's really important to think about because this moment is not separate from 1948. It is not separate from 1967 or 1982 or the Oslo Accords. And so what I wanted to talk about for a little bit is just there's a big sort of emphasis in mainstream media, especially in the US, on Gaza and a victimization of Gazans in a way that deters from the conversations around the fact that there has been a long-standing attempt at the subjugation of Palestinian resistance. And so this long-standing history of genocide, of displacement, of forced removal is inherently tied to self-determination. So up here in the top right, you have a picture of Nakba, when over 3/4 of the Palestinian population were forced to leave by Zionist colonial armies in 1948. And in that moment, what's also really important to recognize is that in addition to the mass displacement of Palestinians, you have the mass displacement of the Palestinian resistance. So in the 1930s and 40s onward, there are regular purging, assassinations, displacements, detention of the Palestinian leadership who are the anti-colonial front for the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian people, right? So in 1948, you have these folks being displaced to refugee camps, predominantly in Jordan and in Lebanon. And then in 1967, you have a pan-Arab army that is also colonized by and formally beaten by the Zionists that led to the colonization and occupation of Syria and Egypt in addition to Palestine. And I'm naming this again because this is another big blow against the Palestinian resistance. And eventually this and fighting in the 1970s in Jordan forced the Palestinian resistance to Lebanon in the 1970s and 80s. And in that moment in 1982, you have the formal invasion of Lebanon by the Zionist military to displace the Palestinian resistance once again. And I'm naming these things because when you're looking at it, if we're talking about over 100 years of political subjugation from the Zionists, that also means that the Palestinian resistance has been forced to restart and reroute itself in multiple places, has been subject to the political and economic context of the countries that are hosting the resistance, and is also part of proxy politics that make it more difficult to actually establish a foundation. And so you don't have a resistance that's been able to develop itself from the onset of Zionism in one place that's secure, that's stable. You have a resistance that's moved countries multiple times, that's seen multiple civil wars, and has been perpetually criminalized by United Nations and international law onward. So this is really important for conversations around self-determination. I think especially with the framing at the top that was looking at law and its relationship, which I'll get into in a bit. If we can go to the next slide. So the siege on Gaza, I think, is something that a lot of people are talking about right now. And the thing that's important for us in relation to self-determination is the siege on Gaza, right? In this moment, there's a lot of discussion in the news and headlines around the fact that Zionists are blocking military aid. Their settlers are destroying food and medical resources that are being brought in through trucks from Egypt to Gaza, all of these kinds of things. The siege itself is something that's actually been in place on Gaza since 2007. And that was a political punishment for the assertion of self-determination from the election of Hamas. So when the Palestinian people elected Hamas in the early 2000s, Zionists and the US colluded to punish Gaza and impose the siege to severely restrict access of resources and also limit travel at the border between in and out of Gaza severely. And this is important because the elections that took place in Palestine that led to the formal election of Hamas are actually elections that were imposed by the United States. And so the United States were trying to force an election to take place in Palestine in the early 2000s in an attempt to get Zionist sympathetic Palestinian leaders in office. And the leadership at that time, the Palestinian Authority and some of the moderate Zionists were pushing back against the United States. And they're like, you can't force an election right now. If you force an election, we are going to lose. You will see that the resistance is going to win. There's not enough popular support in this moment for that. The United States pushed the elections anyway, and this is what happened. The elections revealed that the people wanted Hamas overwhelmingly to represent them formally in the Palestinian government. And this is where you see the split and the sort of association of Hamas with Gaza. They were pushed to Gaza by the Palestinian Authority and by the Zionist entity. And then there's the siege that was placed as a punishment around them. And so right now we are seeing the sort of peak or the climax of the impacts of siege and the impacts of an inability to get resources into a specific place, right? And so even though this moment is intensified in terms of medical resources, in terms of food and all of these things, the foundation for cutting off resources is actually something that's been being built out for almost 20 years now. If we can go to the next slide. And so I think where that's coming from, and an important thing for us, is that the Zionist entity has a monopoly on weapons and on arms. And this is where I think it's especially relevant to our conversations for RIMPAC, right? The Zionist entity, and some of these statistics I have are old. They're actually, the numbers are higher now. So I want to name that. But the Zionist entity is responsible for 2.3, they hold 2.3 of the shares of global export of arms. So they are one of the major manufacturers and distributor of arms across the globe. And the Zionist entity has armed and has trained and has also collaborated with a lot of repressive governments around the world, whether we're talking about East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, whether we're talking about Central America, South America. The Zionist entity has been integral in the collaborations between the United States and East Asia and the Pacific. They are responsible for the distribution of 41% of drones. And again, this is actually an old statistic as well. I think the number has increased since. And they are 10% of the world's total exports of weapons. Yes, I can drop some of the resources for folks so that they can check them out. But what's important for us in this conversation around self-determination is there's a really big emphasis on the sort of like industrious capabilities of the Zionist entity and the bolstering of the military that's been taking place for decades. And in relation to resistance and conversations around who has access to arms, right? The Zionist entity gets exceptions in aid regularly from the United States. They are the only political entity in the world that has clause in its aid from the United States that allows for aid to be directly put towards arms in a way that's unique proportionally versus other countries that receive aid from the United States, for example. And so I think when we're talking about the ability for self-determination it's really important to look at how laws and how economics are structured and stratified to push for the ability of certain people to have legitimate access to being armed, to being weaponized, to having access to defenses versus others. If we can go to the next slide. Sorry, is this the next slide? Yes, it is. Okay. So you have the outlawing of armed resistance that took place in the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. And this is really important because it is what led to the pacification of the Palestinian resistance. So in the 1990s, the Oslo Accords were brokered, and a significant portion of that was the resignation of the Palestinian resistance to to the Zionist entity, an agreement that there would not be arms, which led to the criminalization of arms. So Palestinian movements that were armed were in violation of the Oslo Accords, which is international law. You have the criminalization of self-defense. And so you'll see this a lot, especially through Western propaganda, in terms of the portrayal of self-defense as terrorism or the portrayal of self-defense as barbaric or these kinds of things. And you have the criminalization of Palestinian identity on a global level. And so you'll see this, for example, for folks who live in the United States in different types of free speech bans, or in the mass firing of employees who express sympathy for or identified with the Palestinian struggle in the last 8 months. You also have the protection of Zionism and Zionist speech, either on university campuses or otherwise, and you have the outlawing of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movements across the United States. So you have a really, really intensive investment in the criminalization of anything that is supportive of the Palestinian identity in a material sense, which really only leaves then these sort of neoliberal nods to Palestinian safety and rights, which you'll see in the news, right, with the condemnation of genocide, but not necessarily anything in terms of the right to defend ourselves or the right to fight for land or the right, like the ways that Zionism is actually rooted entirely on white supremacy, Islamophobia, anti-racism, etc. And then you have the colonial reliance on bureaucracy to deflect accountability. And so I think when earlier there's references to United Nations, you have so many United Nations treaties, laws, and things that the Zionist entity have been found in violation of, and it doesn't matter, right? And I think that's really important to think about in terms of the performance, right? The neoliberal aspects of international law of the United Nations. In 1947, there was an alleged partition plan that was imposed upon Zionists and Arabs that they did not agree to, and yet there wasn't even an imposition of that. And that's not to say that the 1947 border should be put in place at all, but just thinking about the irrelevance of bureaucracy and the manipulation of it to justify certain conditions for certain people and to justify power and wealth for others. If we can go to the next slide. So I did want to touch a little bit just on radical resistance and changing currents, because I think that it's also really important to think about where there are holes that are being poked through these sort of narratives in terms of fighting it back against imperialism, fighting back against globalization and things like that. And so a really big one is there's a major loss of influence that the United States has had in the last 8 months. You are seeing the United States politically put in positions it's never been put in before. And these are revolutionary. For example, a few months ago, when Russia and China voted for a ceasefire, the United States was forced to abstain. It's performative, right? It's symbolic. But the United States deferring to Russia and China is an enormous political blow to their image. You also have the fact that they are actually losing control and influence over the Zionist entity. And so because of how little access of information people have about the relationship, a lot of people don't know that the Zionist entity actually operates from a place of exceptionalism, even to the United States, and they always have. But now that's being revealed for the entire world to see. The Zionist entity is not deferring anything to the United States. They have regularly rejected advice from and orders from the United States, which is also putting the United States in a really precarious position on the global front. It is being isolated by the rest of the imperial powers, and it is simultaneously being ignored by the military partner that it's trying to maintain a relationship with. So you actually see the United States in a really, really weak moment on an imperial level, which actually makes this all the more ripe and opportune for something like canceling RIMPAC. You also see a Zionist loss of control. So there's actually major tensions taking place within the Zionist entity between moderate politicians and far right folks. And also even settlers are frustrated with the conditions. They're frustrated with the sacrifice of what they see as a sacrifice of themselves to maintain a Zionist image of victory, right? The refusal to accept a ceasefire agreement in exchange for hostages, right? And so you're seeing this moment where this colonial entity is actually really struggling with maintaining its own image, and actually there's a lot of folks internally who are vying for power and disagreeing with each other about how to move forward in this moment because of the unprecedented gains that are being made by the resistance. And so Palestinian and Arab resistance has been legitimized in the public sphere, right? You have Yemen, you have Iraq, you have Palestine, you have Lebanon, you have all these folks who have been doing a lot for political gains for the Palestinian cause and for pan-Arabism on a critical level, that are publicly being framed a bit differently, right? They're still being condemned as terrorists in certain lights. That's not a question, and that will probably never change because of their emphasis on anti-imperialism and their total rejection of colonialism. But there's actually a different way that resistance is being framed, wherein it's actually being, in certain contexts, in mainstream outlets, being, what's the word? Accepted, justified in a way that previously hasn't been taking place. And our barometer is not mainstream media or mainstream politicians, but the fact that these places are the ones where these types of conversations are shifting is revealing of what is actually happening on the popular front, right? Because what that means is the mass movements that have been taking place for the last 8 months have been really impacting and shifting and creating room for a lot of material shifts that the West is too anxious to even admit to, right? And you also have a global boycott of Zionist militarization, right? The United States has been really, really anxious about whether or not it's going to do anything with arms. Even talking about it is a big deal for the US. But the fact that other countries are either stopping shipments or are criticizing Zionist military actions or are calling for, right, Palestinian statehood, even if it's in the two-state context, which is something that Palestinian politicians and resistance fighters and organizers have been discussing regularly about how to reject that, you have this really, really big shift. And I think so these things are really important for us when we're thinking about the power of something like cancel RIMPAC, right? The playing field last year versus this year is very different for these types of conversations. Anyway, those are just some of the things I want to talk about. Happy to talk about more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for sharing that. Really powerful. We learned a lot. And with that, I would like to pass it to Andan to talk about from Bionusi to talk about the Philippines.
Awesome. Thank you so much to the previous presenters. We'll just wait a bit for the presentation to be back up, but I'll be speaking today on behalf of Bayan USA. Bayan USA is the largest overseas chapter of Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, which in Filipino translates to the New Patriotic Alliance. It was an alliance formed in the height of the Marcos dictatorship. US-backed Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines was instrumental to the campaign to kick out US bases from the Philippines in 1991. And it's a multi-sectoral formation of different mass organizations, alliances that are fighting for national independence, for social liberation, for genuine democracy in the Philippines against, principally US imperialism, a feudal exploitation of the land and the people, and then bureaucrat capitalism, or a way of governing in which the people that are ruling are pocketing money. They're running the government like a business. And so all of these things Bayan is fighting against. And today, when we talk about the role of US imperialism in the economic sphere, right? The role of military exercises in economic violence upon the people, we'll hope to illustrate these things too. Next slide. So again, economic impacts of militarism in the Philippines. This photo is taken from a city in Mindanao, the southernmost island of the Philippines, called Marawi, which we'll be getting into a bit later. The previous presentations talked about what are the cultural impacts, right? The political impacts of military exercises of US imperialism on our people and on our lands. The economic impacts are an essential question. The economy is an essential question to any discussion of self-determination, because when we talk about self-determination, we need to talk about how do you ensure the material needs of the people to actually live? What is the livelihood, right? And US imperialism, its puppets within the Philippine government are very active in denying this right to livelihood of the people. And so this presentation, I want to give a very brief high-level overview of what this looks like in terms of some economic figures, but then focus on what are the impacts on the people with 2 case studies. You know, in our movement, we say, ang tao ang mahalaga. The people are important, right? And it's important that we understand at the basic level, at the ground level, what does having a military exercise mean to the people, right? So let's move into the next slide. Okay, so some fast facts, right? The Philippines, right, is what we call a neo-colony, a semi-colony of the United States. That means that on paper, it is an independent country, but in reality, right, economically, politically, militarily, in terms of its foreign policy, it's dominated by foreign control, particularly the United States. And so in terms of its military apparatus, in terms of how its economy works, we can see this in different budgets and spending, right? So within the Philippines, this year alone, the Philippine military and police received $6 billion for its budget. This is the highest amount dedicated for the amount that the government can spend for different programs or departments. Within that, there's different subcategories. One of them is defense modernization. What that means is that the Philippine military and the Philippine government has been trying to develop its armed capacity, right, for decades now. Despite that, it's still one of the most backwards militaries in all of the Asia and Pacific region. But in 2023, it spent almost $500 million. This year, it's spending almost $700 million. And the Philippine president, Bongbong Marcos, just released a few weeks ago his quote-unquote wish list to modernize the Philippine armed forces by over $35 billion in the next 10 years. So you can really see the ramping up of the militarization of the Philippines in response to, internal conflict, internal civil war in the Philippines, as well as the Philippines being used as a pawn in the rivalry between the United States and China. No? And so we take these huge figures, right, and we compare it to how much is the Philippine government actually spending on the people. For us as overseas chapters, one particular line item that we care about is how much money is the Philippine government dedicating to those migrants and workers overseas. So that's only $49 million, and that's spread across over 10 million overseas workers, right? So if you compare, billions of dollars, right, $35 billion over the next 10 years to not even $50 million for the people, right? The people are important, right? That should show you where the priorities of the government are, right? And that's money that could be going to, again, support for overseas workers, healthcare, education, housing, so on and so forth. This is also impacting folks in the United States, right? Our government here in the US is notorious for funding war everywhere, right? The #1 instigator of war in the world. That's no less true than in the Philippines in terms of its support for war in the Philippines. The US never left our country. After being a colony for over 4 decades, its presence still continues to be there. Even after we kicked out the bases, it found a way to bring its troops back, right? And that's through things like the Visiting Forces Agreement, which basically says that US troops can continue to visit the Philippines as long as they don't permanently base there, right? The loophole there is that they're just always visiting, right? And so there are many different iterations of these military agreements that allow for US presence on Philippine soil. Another one of those is the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which basically says that any site in the Philippines, the US can use for its own military operations, whether that's to store ammunition, to store US troops, use as launching pads for war in the future, and so on. So since 2014, when this EDCA, that Defense Cooperation Agreement, was signed, 109 million has gone towards it, right? So that's within a 10-year span. You look at next year's budget, 2025 alone, Biden has requested for 128 million. So more than the amount spent over the last 10 years to go towards these EDCA sites. So you can also see the ramping up of US interest in locking in its presence in the Philippines as a strategic outpost for US militarism within our country. On top of that, we have things like the Philippine Enhanced Resilience Act, or PERA. PERA means money in Filipino. It's a bill in the Senate that would dedicate $2.5 billion in US military aid to the Philippines over the next 5 years, right? So you have these hundreds of millions, billions of dollars that are going towards denying the economic, political self-determination of the Filipino people. And that money also could be going towards things like healthcare, education, basic social services here in the US, right? So when we talk about economic impacts, these are hard dollar figures that are not going to the people, it's going to the US war machine. Next slide. So the first case study I want to talk about is the Balikatan exercises. And to back up, Bayan USA successfully concluded what we call our peace mission. The peace mission is an anti-war focused mission in the Philippines. We sent over 24 people to learn directly on the ground firsthand from people who are impacted by US militarism, both historically and in the present. So these stories are fresh. Folks just arrived last week, and I'll share more about future opportunities that Bayan USA will share more, but the case studies I'll present today are from 2 experiences that our delegation had there. So first, Balikatan exercises. Next slide. The Balikatan exercises are one of the largest US war games in the Philippines. It's partnered with the Philippine military, and it is a direct result of these unequal military agreements that allow US troops on our soil, right? And so this Balikatan exercise is one of 500 military exercises that are happening in this year alone. And the budget for Balikatan was $5 billion, right? Just for this, not even just a little over a 2-week period, right? 5 billion just for this, to fund bullets, to fund ammunition, to fund food for US troops, right? Again, compare that to the 49 million dedicated to all 10 million plus Filipinos living overseas, right? This Balikatan had 16,000 troops, a majority coming from the US. They partnered with Philippine military. This time around, the Australian Defense Force was also there. The French Navy was there for the first time. And 14 other countries were there observing, right? So you can imagine, right? Our land being used as a war game. And then you just have all these other countries that are just watching the bombs dropping, right? This map right here is the Philippines upside down, if you know the Philippine geography. I'm going to focus most of this on, if you can see like where the US troop is standing, there's like these blue figures that are to the right of his foot. This is in a province called Ilocos Norte, in a place called Lawag, one of the major cities. And that's where Balikatan, one of the exercises of Balikatan happened this year, and where our peace mission was able to visit. Next slide. Here's a zoomed out map. Ilocos Norte is the province here in the Philippines outlined in the red dots. And you can see its strategic location with if you're the US looking at it, right? One of the closest provinces to Taiwan and mainland China, right? So you can imagine why the US military is so intent in having a show of military force in this province in particular. Next slide. This is what Balikatan looked like. These are the sand dunes of Lawag in Ilocos Norte. They're firing live ammunition, huge rocket systems, tanks were rolling in, heavy artillery, vehicles. Some of these weapons supplied by the US, some supplied by the Zionist state of Israel, right? And so there are communities that are living just next to this, right? Or actually on the grounds of these sites too. The economy of Ilocos Norte, a majority make their livelihood from fishing and farming, right? And if you can see where they're firing these rockets, it's straight into the ocean. And so the people that folks talked to on this mission were the fisher folk that were directly impacted by the US military, the Philippine military, firing rockets into their waters, right? Next slide. You can see here, these are a bigger picture of the sand dunes that they were on. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about what were the impacts of the people, on the people, right? I mentioned before that a majority make their livelihood from fishing. We went to several barangay or communities within Ilocos Norte, right? And these are hundreds of families that make their livelihood from fishing, right? Collectively making, maybe around $60 a day. It's not enough to make ends meet. They wake up 3 a.m., they go out to sea, they fish, they come back, they sell the fish in the market or to the neighborhood. Then they go out to drive, what they call tricycles, like public transportation to get more money, right? During this Balikatan exercise, there was what they call a no-sale policy. No-sale policy means you can't fish, you can't sell fish, aka you can't make a livelihood, right? These no-sale policies were implemented without much prior informed information to those communities. And it affected the livelihoods of hundreds, right? If you can't fish, you can't feed your family, right? The Philippine government offered some aid to these fisher folk, but it was a tiny, tiny amount. In this one barangay pictured on the left, only 18 families out of 200 received any form of aid at all. And what they received was $17 for those entire 5 days, plus less than $8 in groceries, right? And these are for entire families, right? In some of the other communities, families already thought that war was upon them because they just heard the bombings, their roofs were shaking, right? Their children are still talking about it today. They point to nearby places and say, that's where the bombings happen. These are where the loud noises are happening, right? So there's psychological trauma happening during these war games as well, right? The communities there are nervous because there's also bases, military bases where US troops are occupying that are next to them. So they don't know, when war or if war breaks out, if their communities are going to be the first ones impacted, right? Next slide. There's also cultural indoctrination going on. Just right next to where these Balikatan war games were happening, there's what's called a military park. This is Cape Boheador Military Park, where military vehicles, amphibious, these tanks, these huge cruisers are being put on public display for children to take pictures of. You can go inside, you can go on top, and it's completely normalized, right? And this is part of the Philippine government, US government's way of saying that, hey, the military is here to protect you, even when they're the ones that are denying your livelihood, right? Next slide. I'm going to speed through this next part, but the next case study I want to talk about is the siege of a city called Marawi in Mindanao. Next. This is Marawi. Marawi is a city in Mindanao where in 2017, there was a US-backed siege and war that was against supposed militants of ISIS, right? It left the city completely destroyed. Over 300,000 people are displaced. It's a ghost town right now, right? These are photos from 2 weeks ago, right? This war was 7 years ago. There's nothing that has been rebuilt, right? Barely any families have returned, right? And while this wasn't a conventional, military exercise in the traditional sense, the forces that were present on the ground actively used it as such, right? We have warplanes, weapons coming from the United States, Australia, Korea, the Zionist state of Israel, many others that were testing, carpet bombs, right, on the city, on the people. And we don't know a lot about it because it was complete media blackout for those entire 7 months. And so this is important for self-determination because Marawi City is in the heart of what's called the Bangsamoro, or the land of the Moro people, which are indigenous Muslim people to the land who have been fighting for their own self-determination for centuries, right? Even against the Philippine government, right? They're a national minority. And so next slide. hundreds of, oh, this is another picture of a building. You can see here, right? Names are written on the buildings. These are the names of the families who went there, defied orders that they can't enter Marawi again, to make sure that they know that someone wants to return back to this land because no one's helping them return, right? So they have to stake a claim to it. Next slide. People are still living in evacuation centers 7 years later, right? When we talk about economic livelihood, we have to see the concrete conditions of people on the ground right now. These are people who are in evacuation shelters for 7 years now. No guarantee of permanent housing, no adequate sanitation. Their bathrooms are filled up, right? No drinkable water. Now some are even having to pay rent, 500 pesos a month, 1,000 pesos a month, right? Or some even facing eviction because the contracts with this temporary housing is temporary, right? And so with their city destroyed, they also don't have access to their original forms of livelihood. Some just make a living by selling things off the side of the road. They get whatever they can buy, right? Some of them are permanently displaced, right? Their homes that they had wanted to go back to are no longer there because of development aggression. There are huge tourist attractions, supposed tourist attractions that are built, like stadiums. The Philippine military is building a camp within the heart of Marawi City, using these funds from EDCA sites, right? That are displacing folks, right? And so money that should be going towards rehabilitating families is being trapped behind, bureaucratic red tape, behind, questionable calculations of how families should actually be funded, and straight up corruption, right? So next slide. The last thing I'll mention is that, this impact of militarism in the Philippines, right? It's affecting the self-determination of the people politically, culturally, definitely economically. There's so much more to discuss, but hopefully these examples can really paint a picture of what is the actual impact of things happening on the ground, right? How do we counter the Philippine government, the US government's publicity stunts that these military exercises are supposed to be increasing, disaster resilience or economic capacity of the people there, when it's the very thing that's stealing that from the people, right? The people are fighting back, right? The communities visited have campaigns that are calling for livelihood and an end to militarization, that are calling for a safe and dignified return of Indigenous people to their ancestral lands. And of course, genuine self-determination, economic self-determination, and political power in the hands of the people. So folks can definitely follow Bayan USA, Bayan Ilocos, and the Sandugo Alliance, which are some of the organizations that are having these campaigns on the ground. Happy to answer more questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Andan. And with that, I will pass it on to Kiera to go into like our summary of everything that we have talked about today. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. How is that? Hi, everyone. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much to our speakers that we had today. Megan, Melamai, Yazan, Andan. Truly honored to have you here representing the various national liberation movements. I am tuning in from the island of Oahu in Hawaii with the Hawaii Watch Party. We have folks from Anak Bayan and JVP here. I'm Kira from Half the Sky. We're a proletarian feminist organization. I'm typically based out of Portland, just here for a short time. But I wanted to go into a summary of the presentation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise in the named struggles for self-determination for Indigenous peoples. Starting from Megan introducing us to the legal and international context behind self-determination and examples of how that's been defined by colonial powers and has not achieved true self-determination. And then Melamai steering us through the cultural and spiritual impacts of military exercises on Kanaka Oiwi, or Native Hawaiian self-determination, from a Native Hawaiian epistemology perspective through the context of mana, pono, genealogy, aina, and aloha. And Yazan from Palestinian Feminist Collective, grounding us through the political and cultural subjugation of Indigenous Palestinians through militarism, settler colonialism, and imperialism.
And then finally from Andan from Bayan USA, speaking to the political and economic conditions and subjugation of Indigenous Filipino people and how US militarism impacts that self-determination. As we can see, there are many parallels between the different national liberation movements for real self-determination, even across oceans and across continents. The impact that settler colonialism and imperialism have on Indigenous peoples has so many similarities because they have one thing in common. They are fueled by the US settler colonial empire and the most violent and well-funded war machine in the world. And as the speakers told us, there's a constant denial of self-determination because the cultural, spiritual, political, and economic subjugation of Indigenous people is a necessity of their imperial control. But we know that when these movements for national liberation join together, when those of us living in the belly of the beast under US imperialism link arms toward international solidarity, we know that we can build a movement against US imperialism. And together we can affect the material conditions of all of us for a future without imperialism and colonialism, a future without war games, with environmental, cultural, and humanitarian catastrophes, and a future without one of the largest culprits of all these issues, a future without RIMPAC. And I'm going to pass it to Misty now to go the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kira. And with that, if we go to the next slide for our question and answer portion. So from the chat, we have 2 questions. So if folks would like to ask the question, please also express it in the chat and we will get to it. For our first question, I believe this is from PFC. It was, how does the PFC see the role of Islam in the current fight for Palestinian self-determination? Then I will focus on to that. And then the follow-up question to that was, how has, if at all, a joint struggle framework of self-determination and anti-imperialism impacted support for Palestinian liberation globally?
Yeah, I think for the first question, Islam is right now, especially, I think there's a lot of political emphasis on religion in a way that really separates it from resistance. I think especially mainstream media, especially in North America, and there's a lot of ways that the resistance's religious components are either delegitimized or used to frame them as backwards or these different things. But Islam has always been integral to conversations around resistance and around self-determination. And there's a lot of ways that the movements by the United States and by the Zionist entity targeting the resistance, especially in the 60s and 70s, targeting more traditional Marxist-Leninist movements, also led to the proliferation of Islamic resistance movements. And I think that's also a really important part of the history, is that a lot of the United States' and the Zionist entities' previous tampering with armed resistance in the 60s and 70s led to the growth and proliferation of Islamic resistance. And that was the backfiring of their tactic, the intentional funding of Islam, in an attempt to pit Islamic resistance against traditional Marxist leftist resistance, not thinking or recognizing that actually there would be collaborations between the two. And you see that in the Philippines, you see that in Palestine, like you see that all over the world where you have Islamic resistance movements. Yeah, and I think for PFC, there's also a really important thing in terms of spirituality and religion and the right to preserve cultural and traditional practices as part of our heritage and our genealogy as Palestinians. I don't know if the second one is open for everyone or yeah.
Yeah, we can open it to everyone, but if you wanted to start them off, I'll just repeat it. How has, if at all, a joint struggle framework of self-determination and anti-imperialism impacted support for Palestinian liberation globally?
I mean, I would just say that there have been a lot of really powerful collaborations. Even historically, you have the Black nationalist movement that had a lot of collaboration with Palestinian resistance fighters. You have both the NDF and Islamic resistance fighters in the Philippines in the 60s and 70s who trained with the PFLP. You have a lot of really intensive connections being drawn between the impacts of capitalism and imperialism on colonial subjects and also on imperial subjects and third world folks. And so I think that when we're thinking through a self-determination lens, there's a lot of ways that different struggles have been able to vocalize support for Palestine and also at the same time draw the connections on a material level between how the United States military, how the Zionist entity, and how the puppet governments of East Asia and Central America and all of these folks have collaborated with the US and the Zionist entity to oppress our people, and how there are material ties that we can work to fight against. In the name of, in some ways, Palestinian liberation, but really in global liberation.
Thank you for sharing that, Idan. Did any of the other speakers want to add on to that as well?
Hi, I can add to that as well. I think when we're talking about from an intersectional lens of perspective, not just from a Kanaka Maoli epistemology perspective, but other ways in which we think about just conceiving our future for all of us across the world, it's important to understand why liberation for Palestinians goes hand in hand with liberation for all peoples. Just like we like to acknowledge how liberation is an important aspect to Indigenous peoples on the continent or even in Hawaii, I think it's important that we always make that connection back to Palestinian liberation. And also, I think it goes within this larger context of how is it that we can support each other, coalition building. I think oftentimes it seems like one issue comes up and we have to all drop everything to just help one person. And I don't think that's true. When we're looking at building coalition and helping create liberation, this new future perspectives, we're also looking at ways in which we can build each other up and like support each other, like from a not just a physical perspective, but how we can lend ourselves to create a broader, more expansive perspective of what it really means to be liberated, not just for our own people, but across the world. And I think that's so powerful. And oftentimes settler systems and settlers try to undermine that aspect of coalition building because they see and understand, I think, from in their own ways that it is powerful to be coming together and finding ways to enact liberation for everyone.
Can add a bit too. The question of Palestinian liberation being tied to the liberation of all people is essential here. I also want to raise the fact that Zionism is an enemy of the people the world over, right? And for the Filipino people in particular, right, we have the Zionist Project of Israel funding, again, not just weaponry going to the Philippine state, the same weapons that were used in Balikatan, the same weapons that were used in the Marawi siege. It's also funding things like plantations in the Philippines, right? It's funding things like educational institutions that are used by the Philippine state to pacify the people, right? So in terms of how embedded Zionism is in the colonial apparatus of even a country like the Philippines, those things also need to be exposed, because that struggle against Zionism from within the Philippines too is part of our own duty to defeat Zionism toward the liberation of the Palestinian people as well.
Great, thank you all for that, all those powerful answers. Oh, sorry, I see you unmuted, Mele. Did you want to add more?
Yeah, I did want to say that I think I just wanted to go back to this idea of we each are all innately deserving of liberation. And that means we each are all innately deserving of self-determination, of our own expressions of Ea. And I think oftentimes when we talk about what's happening in Palestine, we have to be talking about it from the idea of Palestinian-led liberation, their own expressions of self-determination. And they are inherently and innately worthy of being able to have that. And sorry, I just wanted to say that because I feel like that's very important to add from an intersectional perspective.
No, I agree. It is very important to add, and thank you for adding that. And then if we go back to our chat for other questions, I guess this is also just a clarification question. before you and then, was Marcos Son elected through corruption, or why did he receive the vote of the Filipino people? Speak on that, Sylvia.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very long story, but to boil it down, there's a system of Philippine politics in which those who are in the wealthy ruling class, especially those who are supported by the US, can bounce back, right? Because they have the money, they have the power to revise history, they have the power to buy elections, they have the power to rig entire voting systems, and they have the power to influence the culture of the masses, right? And so the answer is, all of the above, right? We will not see an end to dictators or dictatorial families like the Marcoses until we're also able to change the very fundamental problems of the Filipino people. Those are US imperialism, right? The backwards economic system that relies on exploitation of people tied to the land, right? Of which the Marcoses are a land-owning family, and the system of bureaucrat capitalism in which families like the Marcoses are able to milk the government, whatever position they're at, for whatever they can, so that they can rehabilitate themselves over and over and over again, even if they've been ousted.
Great, thank you so much for that. And yeah, you're right, it's a very long story, but that was very solid answer. And then we have another question from Rick. Can anyone speak to the history of Palestinian delegations to Mauna Kea and Standing Rock, and or the Kanaka delegations to Palestine and Standing Rock?
Hello, I can briefly speak on the Kanaka Maoli who did go to Standing Rock. I know in the past Case and her family went as a delegation to Standing Rock on behalf of Kanaka Oiwi. I don't know of any instances currently where there are Kanaka Oiwi who have gone to Palestine, but that's definitely something I want to look further into and better understand, because I think that's something that I would really love to do.
Thank you for having that, Mele. Did any other folks want to share? I think maybe we can even extend the question maybe to different delegations going to the areas from which you could see the shared liberation. Like, let's say the folks from Bayan who had just gone to back to the Philippines to see the current situation, or I know there are different delegations going to different places to better understand what's happening on the ground.
I can briefly speak to the Palestinian delegations to Standing Rock and Mauna Kea. Especially Standing Rock, I think there was a lot of restoration of connections between Indigenous elders, and there were a lot of stories and political connections that it was the Palestinian youth movement who'd gone, where they learned about connections between Palestinian organizers and folks in the American Indian movement, and connections on a very tangible level between like fighters at that time, which I thought was really powerful histories. And there were a lot of parallels drawn between the surveillance and securitization of Standing Rock, and like its reliance on Zionist technologies and Zionist corporations, which was a really important moment for joint struggle. I think that Standing Rock, on a personal level, is also a really important moment where you see right now the contemporary use of extremism and terrorism against certain types of organizers, and that was happening a lot in Standing Rock. Same as the black and red jacketing of Filipino organizers, and the criminalization of Palestinian organizing as terrorism. It's a unique level of criminalization and repression of organizing that I think is especially like tied to folks who are engaged in struggles against capitalism, struggles against imperialism, and struggles for land and self-determination, which was really important. And I think Standing Rock is kind of like the launch of the contemporary wave of that happening, where you see a lot of water protectors now being classified as terrorists. You see a lot of Filipino organizers in collaboration between the Filipino government and the US government being targeted. And you see a lot of Palestinian organizers as well. And then I also just wanted to name that Bayan and Anak Bayan were generous enough to also invite the Palestinian Youth Movement to the Philippines in 2015, and we were able to go to Mindanao. And I think that was also a really powerful moment in learning about the collaborations between the Filipino government and the Zionist entity in the US in their war on Islam. And specifically, I think that Edmund had talked about like the use of ISIS as a shield to terrorize and militarize different folks who are identifying as Indigenous and engaged in righteous struggle. And I think it's really important to talk about these overlaps that exist.
Thanks for adding that, Yazan. And with that, I'll go to another question. Does anyone know what the perception of the Marcos introvert among the Filipinos in Hawaii? If you wanted to answer that.
I think y'all would be in the best position to answer that in Hawaiian Hawaii.
You know, so I will say that there is definitely a varied I guess perception of Marcos. For folks who are unfamiliar, the US, when Marcos was ousted by the People's Movement in the Philippines, sponsored his trip to Hawaii when he was exiled or when he was ousted by the powerful movement of the people. That wasn't just, you know, during that month, but throughout like the course of his dictatorship in the Philippines. And so there is also very like a strong regionalism for sure that happens for those who are from like the same hometown of Marcos, because they have been able to revise a lot of the history that we see in our like even textbooks in the Philippines, where for 20 years of his dictatorship, they've managed to really break it down into just like one paragraph, not even mentioning all the atrocities of his regime. And through like, as and then mentioned earlier, just the extent of that historical revisionism that we see that the US really does to control the narrative around the oppressive regimes that they control, not even just in the Philippines, but even around the world. So yeah, so it definitely is a continuing struggle to kind of break apart those misconceptions and revisionism that happens. More so, there is a very strong, you know, alliance that happens between like the peoples who are still also struggling for like even their basic rights, both in Hawaii and in the Philippines too. So yeah, there is very strong perception, especially like when Marcos visited, but at the same time there's a movement happening against the Marcoses in Hawaii too. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. And so for our next question, we'll also go to how can we help our communities understand how problematic military recruitment of Indigenous, Black, and Brown people as it relates to these issues, especially around the hyper-patriotic tone in July. We are seeing many of our young folk falling prey to military out of economic desperation. Folks wanted to take a stab at that.
Can start. It's a really good question, and I know one that many of our organizations and communities have been trying to tackle for such a long time, because it is our communities that are being targeted by military recruitment. I think a very important thing to expose is just the straight up lies of, you know, the stability given by military enlistment, right? You know, despite spending for things like education, maybe housing, other types of benefits. There are so many stories, even within the Filipino community, but definitely more broadly, of you know, folks not being able to even proceed with their lives because of the trauma of war, right? The reality that you know, what you experience, whether in you know, training or whether you're deployed, is just not worth it, right? We know that it's not worth it, right? But for folks looking for economic livelihood, that's not so on the radar, right? In terms of the immediate future of things. This is especially in the case where we're seeing more and more reports of the US military targeting specific communities to be deployed to their homeland, right? So, for example, Filipino youth are more and more being targeted to be deployed to the Philippines as those troops who are, stationed there, right? So what more, dissonance when you have, you're being sent to harass, inflict violence upon people that are your own, right? Along with this, of course, is the awakening of so many folks who are veterans, who are now taking a stand, right? Especially after Aaron Bushnell sacrificed his life as a martyr, right? There are a lot of others who are voicing out. Even on this peace mission that Bayan just held, there were 2 veterans who also attended, who took a firm stance against war. So I think, really exposing what's happening on the ground and what are the actual realities of folks who come back and don't find the stability that the military has promised them to begin with.
Thank you, and then did any of the other speakers want to add to that as well?
Hi, I can add at least my perspective, because I think this is an important question that I'm asking myself about all the time, of how to better have these types of conversations. And I think what's most important is coming from aloha. And I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous to some extent, but understanding how insidious the military industrial complex is, how people are put in a position where they're forced to make a decision to have to go into the military, and understanding that sometimes people don't have choices in the way that we would like to believe that they do. And so how do we have a conversation that comes through that lens of aloha, of giving compassion and understanding and just genuine love and care for other people, while also being able to have the difficult conversation of saying things that maybe they're not at a capacity to really understand in the same way, but to another extent, maybe even receive. So how do you have a conversation where you can say it in a way where they can actually be open to receiving it? But that's honestly something I'm working on, and I'm open to other ways in which we can have those conversations, because it is hard.
Yes, thank you for adding that. Yeah, I definitely think that even this webinar can serve as maybe just like a beginning of a lot of conversations to be had, especially around militarism and military recruitment. And then just for the sake of time, we will ask one more question. I'm sorry I missed it earlier. But I want to ask, how did you folks get so educated on these topics? Is it personal study, working with groups, or did you get a formal education? And then to add, I think we can include this in that question as well, as do you have any recommendations for organizers in more remote or rural areas? Whoever would like to begin. And I would like to open that as a question for all 3 speakers.
Hi, I can kind of speak to this. So I am an academic, right? I do have a PhD in law, but it's important to note that I've never actually learned anything about liberation from law school per se, or anything from formal education. I did have a course and I did have a professor who's really amazing, and he's the one who helped me kind of better understand having those conversations or how to think. But I already had a really good firm foundation, and I think it comes from 2 places. First, it came from being in organizing spaces, from organizing and being able to have these conversations with people who do incredible work. I mean, Kira is one of my best friends, and she is one of the most profound thinkers I've ever met, and being able to have these conversations and share resources and just have a way that we can have like candid conversations. I think that's the way to learn first and foremost. But the other way is also by just learning our epistemologies or different cultures, because I really do think that that informs the way in which we carry and hold knowledge, or even the way in which we apply that type of particular knowledge. So that's my perspective, but I think the way the settler system is set up, like, school is not meant to liberate us. School is meant to constrain us and to keep us indoctrinated, to perpetuate the system as it is. It's not meant to liberate us.
Thank you for that. Did any of the other speakers want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important to name that. I don't know, for me personally, it was attending events exactly like this, like in the last 10 to 15 years, and just continuing to do so. I think these spaces are these moments where there's a lot of emotional intensity tied to a political moment are really powerful in getting to discover things that we might not have access to otherwise. And these types of spaces where you have folks who are from community, who are from organizations putting on educational events, like it really is as simple as like folks are doing this because they want to bring more folks in, and that's the intention. Like there's no, I think, special way that any folks who are part of these organizations come up any differently than attending events like this before from other folks who are in organizations who are community leaders who bring them in. I think it's a very communal cyclical process. And yeah, I think continuing to engage these spaces, even if it's remotely, is probably the best way to continue to be engaged and get access to information that a lot of governments work hard to hide.
Yeah, just adding on that, the importance of community education, mass education really can't be overstated enough, right? And central to that is also understanding really what are the views of the people on the ground, right? Many of us come from organizations, people's organizations that try their best to be representative of the communities that we're trying to organize, right? We're the three of us, I'm sure, also are not all perfect, right? We also don't know everything. So we're always in that constant communication with the people, with the masses, right? And so wherever you are, talk to folks, right? Understand what their positions are. More often than not, they'll not have the same political stance as you, but they'll have those valuable experiences, right? That make up the content of our politics, right? I mentioned earlier that the people are what's important, right? So talk with the people, understand what's really going on, and then within these, collective spaces, organizations, we talk about what's our analysis of it, right? How do we feed off each other's ideas to make sense of things, and then we go back to those people and have more conversations, right? And that's how we build that collective knowledge. That's how we build that fighting will once we understand the situations we're in, and once we understand that there's something we can do about it.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. So we will end the Q&A here, but if there were any other questions that we missed, please feel free to contact us if you do already have our contact, or check out our Instagram. And if you would like to ask your question again, you can always send a DM there. And we will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, I will pass it on to Cody for some announcements and next steps. Thank you again to all of our speakers. They were amazing.
Thank you so much, Misty, and definitely want to echo that. Everyone give a huge shout out once again to Mele, to Yazan, to Andan for such an incredible presentation, all three of you. Thank you so much for bringing the voices of the people all over the world in the struggle for self-determination. That is what this campaign is all about, and we are so grateful that we could have you all speaking with us and teaching us so much. So for everyone else that's here, I saw already a lot of questions about what comes next. What comes next with this campaign? So again, this campaign, the International Cancel RIMPAC campaign, is a campaign against RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific military exercises. These are the world's largest joint military exercises ever. At least 28 different states' militaries take part in this exercise with devastating impacts on the people. We actually had a previous webinar. This is the second webinar of the series. I believe Kevin or other people have a link to the recording of our first webinar, which talked a lot more about RIMPAC itself and other military exercises. If we could get that link in the chat. Also, if you follow the Resist US-Led War movement on YouTube, you can find the recording of that last webinar. Thank you, Misty, for putting it here. And this webinar itself will also be uploaded to the Resist US-Led War Movement YouTube channel. But again, this campaign really has two main goals. One, it is meant to support the Cancel RIMPAC movement that has been waged for decades by Kanaka Maoli as part of the movement to fight back and end U.S. imperialism and settler colonialism on Hawaii once and for all. It is also meant to rally people and organizations from all across Turtle Island and all around the world who believe that joint military exercises like RIMPAC are an affront to self-determination everywhere. And just like so many of our speakers and people in the chat were saying, it is about joint struggle to help everyone fight and express their self-determination is what this is about. And so what is coming up next, what I'll do is I'll share a series of links. Please bookmark these to follow next whenever you have the chance. So the first one that I'm going to send here is to register for the Cancel RIMPAC Summit and Mobilization this June 29th and 30th in San Diego, California. San Diego is one of the most militarized cities in the so-called continental United States. There will be a summit that we will hold on June 29th, as well as a mass mobilization against the military bases that take place all throughout the city. This is also the city where the U.S. ships that take part in RIMPAC have their reception and send off from. So we're going to make sure that the people have the first say as RIMPAC is happening. The theme for the summit and mobilization is peace, solidarity, self-determination, fight for lives, livelihood, and sovereignty, resist war and militarization. So please follow up and the link that I shared here so you can register for the summit in San Diego. For any member of an organization that's involved in the Cancel RIMPAC campaign or any of our committees, I'm putting a link here to sign up for an all-campaign participants meeting this Tuesday. It's going to be 4:30 p.m. Hawaii time, 7:30 Pacific, 10:30 Eastern time. We'll give all of the most up-to-date, all the updates of the campaign, as well as talk about the travel advisory coming up for the Summit of Mobilization. If we can jump to the next slide, there are some actions you can take right now. And so part of those is actually demanding that countries pull their militaries from RIMPAC. So this first one is a sign-on letter from Jewish Voice for Peace. And Misty actually just shared both of them here, so you can find the links for both of them. The first one is a call for all countries to pull out of RIMPAC. That is allowing, of course, out of many of the different states in here, the Zionist state of Israel that is currently committing genocide, calling for all countries to pull out and not allow any complicity of genocide in RIMPAC. But of course, nearly every single state that is taking part in RIMPAC has either taken part in or supported genocide all throughout the world. And all states should pull out of this for this reason. We want to end RIMPAC once and for all because we're trying to end imperialism, settler colonialism, to fight for genuine self-determination. So there is also another sign-on letter here that is specifically calling for Thailand to pull out of RIMPAC. I'm putting the link for this here. This is from our friends in Thai for Palestine and Seri Palestine. So if you yourself live in Thailand, or if you have friends or comrades there, please send them this letter. And finally, if you jump to the next slide here, our Cancel RIMPAC campaign is also supporting the Resist NATO campaign. The NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization is having its 75th summit. It takes place in different NATO member states each year. This year, it is happening in Washington, D.C. It is happening the weekend after our mobilization in San Diego. So we're going to make sure that even just 1 week apart, we're going to take action against U.S. militarism from the West Coast to the East Coast and everywhere. So if you want to get involved with the Resist NATO Coalition, I am putting a link to our link tree that you can use to get plugged into that as well. And we are hosting a webinar of this campaign as well on the history of NATO expansion, 75 years of aggression, conquest, and people's resistance that is happening next weekend, a week from today on Sunday the 9th. So tune into this as well, and we can better understand how all these different military exercises and military alliances of the US work together to continue to uphold US imperialism as the biggest enemy of the people today. So I hope that you can tune in to some of these next steps coming up. You can take action on our letters. And please, 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 if you are not already involved in the Cancel RIMPAC campaign, if you can jump to the final slide here, you can get involved. Oh, and there's other save the dates here. Maybe Andan, if you can share about the upcoming buy-in peace mission reports.
Yeah, if you'd like to hear more, we're going to have a press conference on the 12th and then a full report back on July 3rd. Just follow us for more updates at that Instagram handle. We're also Buy-in USA on Facebook.
Right on. Thank you so much, Andan. So please, everyone, tune in to learn more about how the Buy-in Peace mission went. We got a really, really great introduction to it earlier. Tune in here to hear more and how you can continue to take action as well.
You know, the links are not hot. You can't click on them and
So-
get it.
Yeah, so we'll also send these links out to all participants. So look for that in your emails. But finally, if you jump to the next slide, this is our final slide. This is just to say thank you. The most recent link that I sent here is how to tune in to the Cancel RIMPAC Coalition. If you can join a committee if you want, as well as information on our summit and mobilization that I listed before. So with that, that is all of our calls to action. We hope to continue to see you in the course of this campaign. I'll leave it to Misty for our final closeout.
Yes, thank you again to all of our speakers. As I mentioned, we will be sending out the recording once we can get it uploaded, as well as the links and slides. Thank you again, and we hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend, and a great rest of your month. Yeah, here's to fighting together. Thank you.